Okay, universe, we are back with another close reading strategy. This time, a literary text close reading strategy. It is called SIFT. Obviously, that is an acronym. Anyway, just a quick reminder that close reading is rereading a text, giving a second read, carefully, closely, consciously, to figure out what is in that text that makes it work. What are the decisions, the choices that an author made to make their text more effective? And we're going to talk today about a poem and a short story. They're both going to be linked down below, and I'll get into specifics in a minute. One thing I do want to point out is that when you are thinking about poetry and short fiction especially, the choices that an author makes, very important. When you're dealing with a poem, you have a limited number of words, a limited amount of space. And even in short fiction, you have a limited amount of space to try to get the ideas across that you're trying to get across, right? I said that funny, but you get what I'm saying. The choices are that much more important in poetry and in short fiction than they are in, like an 800-page novel. So we'll talk about how that works after the theme song. Okay, very quickly, just a tour through this particular tool, SIFT. The S stands for symbols. If you don't know what symbols are, I guess they're objects that take on some additional significance. They could stand for an idea or a person or a place, but objects in a poem or a story. Images, which are words that appeal to your five senses, sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. Also, then F, figurative language, so metaphors and similes, but also anything like alliteration or some of those fancy poetic devices, even rhyme could fit under figurative language. And T, which actually has several different possibilities. You could go with tone. So how does the speaker feel about the subject that he or she is discussing? You could go with theme. What is it that the author wants me to understand after I am done reading this? You could go with title. Like, how does the title tie this particular piece of literature together? We are going to be doing one poem, one short story. We're going to start with the poem. This is called The Sign in My Father's Hands by Martín Espada. I encourage you, please stop, go down to the description, click on the link, read that poem, and then come back. One thing I hope you've kind of noticed as we've gone through these close reading strategies is that nowhere, none of them, nada, zilch, zero, nowhere does it say, tell me what happened. Right? We're not looking for a plot summary of a poem or a story. We're not looking for just a paragraph of paraphrase of an informational text. What we're looking for is some specific details that you've unpacked and thought about more carefully than the thing as a whole. So SIFT in particular is really good at identifying some of those important pieces. The S does not stand for summary. The S stands for symbol. So when you're thinking about The Sign in My Father's Hands by Martín Espada, there are some choices, right? He talks about his father holding a picket signs or going out onto a picket line. He talks about the leaflet, right? He's looking at his father's photograph. That photograph could be a symbol. But I really like in this poem the way his father's hands become a symbol. He actually, the very last line is about searching his father's hands for the sign of a miracle, where very clearly then he's associating the appearance of his father's hands after his father has been in jail and presumed dead. His father's reappearance there as a miracle, and the hands themselves are a sign of that miracle. Imagery, there are a couple of really nice spots here with him, and I say nice from an analytical perspective, not from what's obviously being discussed, because it's Espada's description of the crowd, or the way that Puerto Ricans can show up dead with bruises on their body that nobody can explain. There's a visual image. And the dead cat overrun with parasites. I mean, obviously these are not nice things, but they're very clear imagery that help to create a particular feeling in the poem. For figurative language, there's a nice metaphor, again, not nice, but you know what I mean. There's a metaphor about the crowd glaring with canine hostilities. It's a metaphor that the crowd, obviously they were not literally dogs, but they were as mad as dogs at the protesters. There's that line right in the middle of the poem about how he's looking at that photograph of his father, and he says it's like a mirror of his own darkened face. But for this one, I'm actually, the one that I think is perhaps most valuable to write about is not a metaphor or a simile, but rather an allusion. That's allusion with an A. An allusion is a reference to some previous work of literature, to religion, to history, to mythology. And the whole main idea of this poem, from the title to the last line, is a reference to the biblical story of who we call Doubting Thomas. This was Jesus after he was crucified. He came back from the dead, and Thomas, one of his followers, was like, bro, I don't believe it. Nobody comes back from the dead. And Jesus was like, well, here, these are my hands. That's where the nail went through. So the way his father, Martín Espada's father, and this is a true story, it's dedicated to his father, the way his father has returned from the netherworld, he actually calls it a resurrection, right? So he's looking in his father's hands for a sign, the same way that Doubting Thomas had looked at Jesus's hands. That's allusion can go under figurative language, and that's what I would talk about here. You could also save the allusion for T for title, right? The sign of my father's hands, that's the biblical allusion. But you could also talk about tone here for the T. And obviously there's some set. He talks about being filmy-eyed. He talks about the netherworld, right? All of these images of death create this sense of sadness. And then finally there's theme. And I think that we can say Martín Espada is not just like, oh, I'm glad my dad's alive. It's more than that. There is a definite racial component to this. It opens with African-American and Puerto Rican workers protesting because they weren't allowed to work at the 1964 World's Fair. So it begins that way. There's, as I mentioned earlier, the line about how Puerto Ricans sometimes die in jail with bruises that nobody can explain. There's this distinctly political and racial overtone to the entire thing. And I think what Martín Espada is saying is that, hey, growing up Puerto Rican in New York City, or in a Puerto Rican family, there was danger. This was a time when we did not have racial equality, and it kind of sucked. And that's going to bring us around to the short story. This is one of my favorite short stories on the planet. It is called Wants by Grace Paley. There's a link to it down below. There's also a link to her. She's giving a speech, but the first part of that speech, the first 10 minutes or so, she's reading the story. So if you want to see her, she's since deceased, but you can see her reading the story too, if you want to. And again, no summary. I'm not asking you to tell me what has happened in the story. When an English teacher assigns you to do an analysis of a story, analysis of a poem, or even analysis of an informational text, the teacher has read that, right? We don't need the summary. So we're just going to dive right into symbol. So I would start with, where does this story take place, right? It takes place on the steps of a public library, a little bit inside the public library, and then back outside to the steps of the public library. And the whole thing begins with, she has these 2 books that are overdue, she wants to return them, and then she's bringing them back. So think about these books, the 2 books that are overdue for a long time, that she takes back to the library. She thinks she is done with them, but then she checks them back out. Their titles are actual real titles by a woman named Edith Wharton, as noted in the story. But the titles are The Children and The House of Mirth. So you can hold on to those books, that idea of, she's got these things that she has held on to and that she thought she could return, but now she needs them back. The House of Mirth and The Children. I'll talk about those when we come back in just a minute, but let's go to imagery. There's some really good imagery in this story, and I'm thinking in particular of our narrator's description of the sycamore trees that had been planted when her own children were born, but had just that day come into the prime of their lives. There's an image that you have then, even if you're not sure exactly what a sycamore tree looks like, you know what a tree looks like when it is in the prime of its life. It's full and radiant and green. There's also a moment where the ex-husband describes the smell of sugar-cured bacon coming from the apartment next door. And what I like about that particular image, the smell of that bacon, first of all, everybody knows what bacon smells like. Bacon is awesome. But second of all, it's in a context where he says, we, you and I, ex-husband, ex-wife, we did not have bacon. They had bacon next door, but we could pretend that we had bacon. And let's be honest, pretend bacon is the saddest kind of bacon that, well, no, Canadian bacon. So it's like real bacon, Canadian bacon, pretend bacon, or I don't know. But anyway, you get the point that this was not a good marriage that was happening. Figurative language. There's a couple of really good pieces of figurative language, and you might start by talking about how she describes both her ex-husband and her current husband as being rocks, that she is under the rocks of what her ex-husband and her husband wanted. This is literally and figuratively a very weighty thing, right? That the whole point of this story, I think, and I'll get to it in a second, is that she feels like she's never been able to get what it is that she wants, that she is being weighed down under the stone of what her ex-husband and her current husband want. They are this incredible burden for her, which is keeping her down. And this story, one of the reasons why it's one of my favorite short stories, is that it has by far my favorite paragraph in the entire English language. That paragraph is centered around a simile. He had a habit throughout the 27 years of making a narrow remark, which, like a plumber's snake, could work its way through the ear, down the throat, halfway to my heart. He would then disappear, leaving me choking with equipment. What I mean is, I sat down on the library steps and he went away. T for title. The title is wants. The sort of central conflict of this whole story is that the ex-husband says, you never wanted anything. And she says, I did. And this is where the symbolic meaning of the books might come into play, right? The books were called The Children and the House of Mirth. Now we know that she did have children. She and the ex-husband did have children. But notice the way she talks about the things that she couldn't do for her children, including like being active with the local school. She feels like she has let the children down in some way. And the House of Mirth, if you don't know what the word mirth means, it means happiness, it means joy, right? She wanted a happy house. She wanted a joyful house, but she couldn't get it. It wasn't there. She and the ex-husband divorced, and even, her current husband's reasons being the rock upon her, even her current house is not one of mirth. Tone. There's definitely a conversational tone to this, and there's a bit of, nostalgia, but I think, once again, if you could get it down to one of the four, mad, sad, glad, or afraid, we are definitely in the sad camp here. Not only with the details that she's using, like the plumber snake and her ex-husband leaving her choking with equipment, although, you could make the argument that that's a little bit angry. But all of this, I did want things. I wanted to be the effective mother who fought the school system. I wanted this, I wanted that. These are all things that didn't happen. They never came to be. There's a wistfulness and a sadness in the way she describes them. And that brings us around to T for theme. In the Martín Espada poem, there is one very specific real thing that happened. Martín Espada's father was arrested, presumed dead, came back. But this is a fictional story. This never happened. There's no real component to this. So then you've got to start thinking, okay, Grace Paley, as an author, she wants me to believe differently, or she wants me to act differently because of a lesson that I take away from this. What lesson is there? And I would point you to the last three words, my hospitable remarks. Hospitable is a bit of a tricky word. It's a big word, and it's not a word that is commonly said by students. It's not even a word I commonly say, but it comes from the same root as hospitality. It's you are making other people feel welcome. You're making other people feel good. And she says, I am better known for my hospitable remarks. I am better known for making other people feel good. And you can start to see how all of these things, the symbols, the imagery, the figurative language, the tone, even the title, bring us to this particular conclusion that here is a woman who has spent her entire adult life making other people feel good. And you can begin to understand how she does not have that happy house because she's under the rock of her husband's reasons. She is burdened by them. That all of the things that her ex-husband wants, like a boat, those are things that are manly and like physical, and the things that she wanted, like to be a better mother, or the end of the war. You can kind of that there's a war mentioned in there. These are all like bigger ideals, and that she doesn't get them. So it sort of brings us around to this whole idea that women are very often expected to make men feel better about themselves with no care or with no thought for how they themselves feel. And I believe that this story sort of ties all of those things really nicely together with that last turn of phrase about my hospitable remarks, because it's there. It even kind of sounds out of place with the whole conversational tone of the rest of the story, but it's there where she says, I am known for making other people feel better. I never get to feel better. So there you go, that is SIFT. This is a really easy acronym graphic organizer to think about. There's a link to this as a printable PDF down below, but you don't have to carry around the PDF with you. You can just remember SIFT, S-I-F-T, and you can, you get the text from your English teacher, you open up your notebook, you take out a piece of paper, you write S in one part of the margin, and you just start working, okay? Now, you don't have to have it on paper in order for it to be an effective graphic organizer that you use, but this does a really nice job of covering some of the most important and most basic things about literary text. The symbolic images that are being used, the actual imagery that is being used, the figurative language that's being used, how does the title fit, how does the tone affect us, and what is the theme that the author is trying to get us to understand when we consider all of that stuff together. The next episode is about typecast. It's a poetry-specific literary text graphic organizer and acronym, but I will see you for the next one.